So I was doing what everyone should be doing in their spare time, playing some Resident Evil 4 Mercenaries, in this case via the remake, and while I was running around shooting dudes, kicking ass, I had a thought come to me. That thought was that this was an awesome remake of one of my favorite games of all time. A remake that pays so much respect towards the original and improves upon it so much that you could make an incontrovertible argument that it's absolutely the best way to play Resident Evil 4. But despite that, I couldn't help but feel there was still something about the original that I preferred deep down. No, I'm not talking about the story changes or how much goofier the original is. No, I think what it is the aiming scheme. The original Resident Evil 4 implements an aiming scheme that I'm going to identify as cursor aiming, where the reticle in question, in this case a laser sight, isn't confined to the center of the screen, rather moving across the screen dynamically. Resident Evil 4 Remake implements what I would call crosshair aiming, where the reticle in question is always center on the screen, and aiming is as much aiming as it is moving the camera. I know there is probably a better way to identify these aiming schemes, but for the sake of this video, let's just call it cursor aiming and crosshair aiming. And as for the sake of this video, we're just shooting the shit, hanging out. This really isn't going to be some deep dive in game mechanics. I have no qualifications or professional experience to do so. This'll simply be me pondering some ideas and thoughts. So if any of you have any further ideas or thoughts, please, I'd love to read about it. So to start, I want to say right out of the way that I don't have any hot takes regarding aiming schemes in games, only some obtuse preferences. Regarding Resident Evil 4, yeah, I can't help but feel there was something more stimulating, dynamic, even cinematic about aiming compared to the remake. The remake aims just about like every other third-person shooter out there, or even every shooter out there. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I'll admit right away that the crosshair style aiming scheme that most games have is by far the easiest to understand and the smartest way to have an aiming scheme in a video game. Looking back, OG Resident Evil 4 is kinda weird. You can't move and shoot, which to be fair, the game is completely designed around that. You're not supposed to be able to move and shoot in the original. But not only that, you move the aiming reticle with the left stick, where the right stick aims in most other games. But finally, yeah, the reticle moves across the screen. It's not confined to the center, and that simply feels a lot different from the crosshair style aiming scheme. Crosshair aiming is usually the more intuitive method, because it usually functions just like moving the camera. So for gamers picking up a game for the first time and getting comfortable controlling the camera, they're also getting comfortable aiming a weapon since the action is exactly the same. This has inadvertently made the original Resident Evil 4 a little alienating for potential new players. I can testify that I have siblings and have witnessed other gaming content creators that I follow struggle to get a grasp on the aiming in OG Resident Evil 4, but I feel if you can get past that, the aiming in the original feels more satisfying to me. I don't know, popping off headshots just feels better. I honestly can't really describe it. Perhaps it's because the reticle or laser sight dynamically moves across the screen. In the remake, and essentially every other shooter out there, every shot kind of feels the same, or at least the perspective remains the same. So across many third-person shooters, aiming gets a little, I don't know, boring? The cursor style aiming is also a little more visually stimulating to me. It's pretty neat actually how the primary center of aim is actually more around here, which contrasts nicely with the character model on the other side of the screen and provides a better field of vision. Whereas in the remake, having the reticle in the center of the screen kinda makes the left side a tad claustrophobic with the large character model taking up so much space in it. Of course, I'm being a little hyperbolic, but I hope you can kinda see what I'm talking about. This isn't to say a cursor style aiming scheme is automatically better for me in every case. After revisiting some other games that have a cursor style aiming scheme, I was reminded of how challenging they can be without the proper investment. So let's explore a few of them and see how they hold up in practice. Any of you ever played Modern Warfare Reflex? Do any of you actually know it was a thing? This was the first time I ever experienced the original Modern Warfare, after wanting to get into the series because for some reason Call of Duty was the hot gaming franchise the cool kids played in elementary school. Yeah, I don't know what was up with that. Anyway, this is actually not a bad port of Modern Warfare save for the horrendous graphics. The game is by and large the same experience as the HD versions or even the remaster. This version is quite unique as it prioritizes motion controls via the Wii infrared sensor. As a kid, I was fully immersed in playing this version. I had the Wii remote and nunchucks slapped into that dumbass Wii Zapper peripheral, and I was always standing while playing the game. I recall having good times with it, but nowadays, ugh. Okay, in the spirit of full disclosure, I only gave the game about 45 minutes, but man did it feel clunky. Visually, I will say it's still more interesting to look at compared to the original. But those controls, man. One thing about a cursor-style aiming scheme is that it's very challenging to implement even when you have motion controls. For the Wii, you have to aim the cursor with the motion controls to not only aim, but also to move the camera to look around by pointing the cursor to the edges of the screen. Perhaps it's how this game implements it, or maybe I just didn't give it enough time, but here it felt awkward. There's no shortage of control options, but I gotta admit, I don't really want to spend an hour tinkering until it feels the most comfortable. Maybe I had that kind of patience as a kid, but not really anymore now. Compare this to just playing it on PC with keyboard and mouse, or in this case with the controller but with a gyro motion control aiming scheme. One massive benefit to crosshair style aiming is that it makes a gyro motion control scheme very easy to implement and control well. It's what I always use for the Resident Evil remakes and really any other third-person shooter I play. But even in first person, I gotta admit, it felt really good. Sure, I still feel on Wii it's more visually stimulating, but on PC with a controller using gyro, it feels better. I think it's because here I still have independent control of the camera using the right stick. That may be the ultimate catalyst with cursor-style aiming schemes, where they tend to work best when you either have no full control over the camera or complete control over the camera. What I mean by no full control is like arcade-style shooters. They're on rails, so the game decides where the camera looks, so you only have to worry about aiming. Shit, even in Mario Galaxy, the cursor feels so good to control because you're not going to be moving the camera with it. And in the case of Resident Evil 4, the perspective remains pretty static due to the game's tank controls. And when aiming, yeah, the reticle moves the camera, so to speak, like in Call of Duty Reflex, but the game feels better designed to accommodate it. And the fact that you aim with an analog stick, which surprisingly feels easier to grasp than using motion controls in COD Reflex. Take a look at Resident Evil 4 Wii. This version also uses motion controls for its cursor aiming, similar to COD Reflex, but when aiming, the cursor doesn't move the camera, only the stick does. So having that independent control feels more accessible, and yeah, those who struggled to get into OG RE4 tend to feel the Wii version was much easier to understand. Maybe with enough time and dedication, COD Reflex could be my definitive way to play, because I still feel there's a lot of potential with this kind of cursor aiming scheme, but maybe for another day. Okay, midway update on the script. I'm a dumbass. So I decided to go back and give COD Reflex another go because I felt there really must have been one setting that I missed. And I was right. The secret sauce that I discovered that totally changed my experience was switching any aiming option in the menu to precision. For scoped weapons, it jacks up the sensitivity and makes the cursor control much more precisely. Then, for aiming down sights, it completely improved my experience to the point that I actually had a hard time putting the game down. See, in the standard control scheme, aiming down the sights still moved the camera gradually, making it difficult to really aim precisely. Not to mention the actual cursor movements felt laggy and delayed. When set to precision, then aiming down the sights made the cursor more sensitive and accurate, as well as preventing the camera from moving too much until the cursor is at the very edge of the screen. This sort of reinforces my point about independent camera controls. In the regular control scheme, the camera and aiming the cursor are constantly fighting with each other when aiming down the sights, and it doesn't feel good. With precision aiming, I can mostly focus the camera when firing from the hip, and then when aiming down the sights, not only does the cursor feel way better, but the camera is also more restricted, so I have an easier time precisely aiming. If it sounds weird, then I highly implore you to try it out for yourself. I'm serious, that one little settings tweak made playing this game actually really fucking fun. Sure, I'll still contest that playing on PC with gyro or even mouse may technically be more accurate, but the metric for me here isn't exactly what's more accurate, it's what's more fun. And damn, I gotta admit, I just might believe that COD Reflex is the more fun version, but it still remains as a cautionary tale on how difficult cursor aiming can be and why many games probably don't use it anymore. Lately, I've only heard that the GoldenEye reboot game is nothing more than a Call of Duty ripoff. What made this version special was the motion control aiming on the Wii version. The original GoldenEye was from an older era of first-person aiming schemes. Usually, the standard control scheme was tank controls and aiming was rather automated. You only had to point in the general direction of your targets. If you wanted to be more precise, you could sacrifice your movement controls to move a cursor around the screen with the stick, which worked but always felt weird to me. Since the cursor always centered itself, you had to hold the analog stick in place, which is quite challenging, though this could just be because of the N64's really stiff analog stick. This style of aiming scheme persisted for a while in other games like Perfect Dark, Time Splitters, and Red Faction, which would also provide other aiming options before the dawn of twin-stick aiming that games like Halo popularized. Anyway, with this in mind, this actually makes the GoldenEye reboot on Wii more faithful in spirit with its cursor aiming controls. Comparing it to COD Reflex is tricky. The cursor feels similar, but even with the sensitivity jacked up, it still doesn't feel as snappy as I'd like. The game is loaded with options to tweak the controls, but even after about 20 plus minutes of adjusting dead zones, pointer speed, and all that crap, I couldn't quite get it to a setting that I like. It got so bad that I had to rely on the game's own aim assist options, which for cursor aiming controls should never be a consideration. For COD Reflex, the game changer for me was its aim down sights precision option. It felt so good and natural, and I can't quite get a similar setting here in GoldenEye. My biggest problem in GoldenEye is how the cursor can't reach the edges of the screen when aiming down sights. You can adjust the camera dead zone, which is nice, but the game also lets you halt the camera by holding the A button down, which I prefer. But it sucks when I can't reach the edge of the screen because fuck me, I guess. I'll admit, it's probably not fair, as while the pointer controls are similar, these are still two differently designed games. GoldenEye has a larger focus on stealth and slower progression, but when the shooting got going, I was legitimately getting frustrated. I know if I simply spent more time dicking around in the settings, I could get it close to perfect for me, but I also think it's perfectly reasonable to expect better default options than what's offered here. It makes me understand a little more why this game was shipped with a Gold Classic Controller Pro as the intended way to play the game, but I'd still recommend people to try the pointer controls for themselves. I can't say how this game feels with the standard twin stick scheme in the reloaded version on 360 and PS3, and because there's no PC version to inject gyro, there's not really a way to test that. There is the PS3 version with the PlayStation Move controls, but I'm not sure how that plays. I think I can say if you're going to play the GoldenEye reboot, try it with the motion aiming controls first, as that's what makes this game unique to begin with, despite my troubles with it. It may be more comfortable with standard twin stick aiming, but then it may start to feel like a generic Call of Duty clone. In case you haven't seen my videos on Resident Evil 5, I'm a huge fan of the game, and I put it right up there with the original Resident Evil 4. What makes these two games special installments to me is probably the unique and satisfying aiming schemes in them. I've already expressed this for Resident Evil 4, but a lot of what I said also applies to Resident Evil 5. The only thing that kinda holds this game behind Resident Evil 4 for me is that there really isn't a reliable motion control cursor aiming scheme. Resident Evil 4 on Wii was so fun, so satisfying, and arguably the best third-person shooter controls to me, that the fact there isn't a reliable equivalent for Resident Evil 5 really sucks. Yeah, the Switch version has gyro, but it still uses the laser, and since the laser also essentially controls the camera when moving it to the edge of the screen, it feels a little awkward. Not to mention the laser just feels less accurate in this case. The gyro itself doesn't feel that well implemented, so it fails to aid in precise, accurate aiming. The PlayStation 3 version played with the PlayStation Move controller is a little better in my opinion, but the gyro cursor controls still don't feel as good as Resident Evil 4 Wii. The PC version is interesting since it allows for several aiming options. For keyboard and mouse, there's an option called Mouse Look, which essentially switches out the cursor aiming scheme for a crosshair aiming scheme. Definitely something for people more familiar with modern third-person shooter aiming controls. When mapped to a gyro on a controller, it feels pretty great, not gonna lie. I felt no disadvantage with accuracy, and the aiming felt about as satisfying as other third-person games with gyro motion controls. But what really makes the PC version neat is the cursor aiming scheme for keyboard and mouse. This replicates the Wii and PlayStation Move cursor-style aiming. The weird thing about it when mapped to a controller's gyro is that it feels amazing, incredibly smooth and responsive, way better than the gyro on PS3, and dare I say even better than Resident Evil 4 on the Wii. You still have independent control of the camera and the accuracy of the mouse look scheme, but with that more dynamic, aesthetically pleasing, less disorienting feel of other Crosshair style games. This would without a doubt be my favorite way to play Resident Evil 5, but unfortunately it requires workarounds. If you have seen my last video on Resident Evil 5, you may know what I'm talking about, but this game isn't designed to have keyboard and mouse inputs and controller inputs simultaneously. I could make the controller a virtual keyboard, but I hate looking at keyboard prompts with a controller in my hand. With the quality of life patch that's available for the old version of Resident Evil 5 on PC, it removed the prompt that appears when controller schemes change. The only issue then was the QuickTime events, but that was partially fixed when Resident Evil 5 on PC was randomly patched earlier this year to feature the modern console editions like a wider FOV and selective automated QTEs. But now the control prompt change is visible again. Darn it. It's so close to being perfect. But alas. There's some other notable examples of games with the cursor aiming scheme I'd like to mention. Scarface on the Wii is one I haven't played, but I hear feels amazing. Portal 2 on PS3 has PlayStation Move support, which, again, I haven't tried, but it looks really cool with the new mechanics they added for that version. The Wii Zelda games use a cursor for aiming. Twilight Princess feels pretty good, but you can tell this was early Wii controls. I mean, this calibration screen just blows my mind. You gotta measure the width of the sensor bar compared to the screen and point the cursor at the right distance to overlap the graphic? The hell? Overall, it feels pretty good, but again, the caveat with cursor aiming with motion controls is that you gotta nail how that cursor feels. It has to feel completely responsive, and Twilight Princess on Wii feels a tad sluggish, like there's a half-second delay to inputs. Skyward Sword felt a lot better by comparison, either because of the gyro implemented inputs, or Nintendo just got better at programming cursors. There is one final game I'd like to bring special attention to for being one of the most versatile games with various aiming options. Metroid Prime is one of my top favorite games of all time, and the remastered version on Switch is probably the most goated game for aiming options. There's the standard controls, which more or less is the same from the original GameCube release. Because these controls are more in line with old school FPS controls, with tank movement and an aim button that halts movement, it would feel extremely alienating for new players. Despite that, however, I would encourage most people to give it a chance, because the game was still completely designed around these primary controls. Sure, the other control options are more accessible, but it's not like the original ever felt compromised from it. I haven't touched these controls in a long time, and it was surprisingly comfortable to jump back in. So for anyone picking up Prime for the first time, I'd encourage using these controls first, at least until you know for certain that they're not for you. The biggest addition to this remaster, besides the overhauled visuals, is the newly implemented dual stick controls. Anyone who's played an FPS ever since the dawn of Halo should immediately have no trouble here. Even as someone who typically doesn't like dual stick aiming because aiming with an analog stick isn't the most comfortable or accurate way to aim in my opinion, I gotta admit it feels pretty nice here. I would never call the original controls a handicap, but damn it, this is good. The evidence speaks for itself, with this remaster rekindling a lot of interest for Metroid Prime, because now so many new players were able to easily jump in thanks to these new twin-stick aiming controls. This is even the default option as soon as you boot the game, which admittedly is the smart choice. They've also, thankfully, included gyro aiming for people like me who don't typically like aiming with a stick, and for the most part it feels just as good as playing Modern Warfare on PC with gyro on a controller, or really any motion control scheme for Crosshair style aiming. Finally, they've included the pointer controls, which replicate the cursor aiming from Metroid Prime Trilogy on the Wii. I've heard far and wide that many people find this control scheme very awkward. I have a few theories as to why that is. The first thing to mention, and I hope it goes without saying, but usually for cursor aiming, it's best if you can A, utilize motion controls for better accuracy and player response, and B, allow for separate hand gestures. Using cursor aiming on a two-handed controller simply feels extremely weird. Play Mario Galaxy on Switch with the Pro controller and you'll see what I'm talking about, though I have read some people preferring it that way, and hey, that's great. But for most, it's weird. I think it's because trying to move a character around with an analog stick while also moving your wrist on the same hand to aim just feels weird. It's why cursor aiming on Resident Evil 5 with a two-handed controller actually felt quite comfortable, since you can't move and shoot at the same time. The second reason I would suspect is that most people are probably used to an infrared cursor, which simply feels way different and arguably better than a gyro cursor. It's still a case-by-case basis, and I can recall Prime Remastered pointer controls felt noticeably noticeably different and not as nice as Prime Trilogy on Wii. The same goes for Mario Galaxy. I prefer using the Wii Remote and the infrared sensor for moving the cursor compared to Gyro, but despite the difference, all it took was a little time to get used to it, so it's not that bad. But finally, I suspect it's because the cursor also controls the camera, and for aiming it simply doesn't feel that good. Remember my initial issues with kata reflex? It's a similar thing. You gotta have that independent control of the camera to an extent to make aiming the cursor as comfortable as possible. In that aspect, I can understand how most people can't jive with the pointer controls in Prime Remastered. However, it still stands as my favorite way to play Metroid Prime. I'll try to explain the best I can. When using twin sticks with the gyro aim enabled, I couldn't help but find it made the game visually disorienting. Those micro adjustments caused by me simply holding the controller causes these twitchy movements that for aiming is not that much of an issue, but for simply looking around and observing the environment, it's a little distracting. I didn't really feel it much for aiming in third-person games like the new Resident Evils, since the gyro is only active while aiming. Nor did I feel it much when playing Call of Duty 4 since the game is mostly shooting and not exploring an environment. I felt it when playing Portal on Switch with the gyro enabled. Yeah, for aiming it's great, but since Portal is also about carefully observing your environment to solve puzzles, those small twitchy movements caused by the gyro sort of makes me nauseous. I know, it sounds a little crazy, but I can't be the only one who feels this. Since Metroid Prime is less about precise shooting and more about looking around the environment to explore, then those same gyro twitches make me not prefer the twin stick controls compared to the pointer controls. With the pointer controls, yeah, it makes precise aiming not ideal with the cursor as the camera moves, but for simply looking around, it's much smoother and visually nice to look at, and makes traversing the environment feel more engaging. For aiming, the secret sauce for Metroid Prime is the lock-on feature. This saves pretty much every control scheme in the game, as lock-on ties them all together. It's just like Zelda, where you can lock onto a target and strafe around them. For using the pointer controls, being locked on halts the camera and instantly makes the cursor feel much better for precise aiming. And it feels so good to be locked onto one target while shooting at another target with the free cursor. It results in that perfect blissful balance of leisurely looking around the environment with the cursor smoothly moving the camera and precisely aiming with the cursor when locked on that isn't quite there for me in other aiming options. I know I'm probably an extreme minority and understand it took a long time for me to fully get comfortable with it, but after the initial hurdle, it only makes playing this game far more engaging and fun compared to conventional controls. I haven't had much experience playing games in VR, except for the VR version of Resident Evil 4 on the Oculus Quest 2. So far, I see aiming in VR to be a natural evolution of cursor-style aiming in the old days of Wii motion controls that was so needlessly left in the dust. Not enough people really gave it a chance when it really offers an incredibly fun experience to your standard controller inputs. I understand it has to be implemented well and take some investment, but I feel the fun to be had is more than worth it. I ponder what it would be like if more modern games would simply include a cursor aiming option for controllers with gyro support. Especially with modern controllers like the Switch Joy-Cons, it could make for the ultimate aiming setup. Use the gyro for controlling the cursor so as long as it feels good to control, and maintain complete independent control over the camera with the right stick. I can only use my imagination to perceive what it might be like, and I imagine it would be unbelievably fun. But since most mainstream games don't have cursor aiming, it looks like my best bet is VR. So for the case of Resident Evil 4 Remake, the closest path to that vision is to play the VR version on PS5. Thankfully, the cost of a PSVR 2 is only $550. That about sums up all I wanted to say about this little topic. I hope to those who made it this far can understand my unique preferences in regard to aiming schemes in video games, and perhaps find new appreciation with cursor aiming that's not very common anymore. This isn't to say I don't like crosshair aiming. Far from it. Again, I'll stress, Crosshair is by far the smartest and most accessible aiming configuration for games. There's a reason it's become the standard for the past 2 decades. But cursor aiming, when done well, offers a more immersive, stimulating, and fun experience in my honest opinion. I understand it's not easy to get into and does require a lot of player investment to properly get used to, but like I said earlier, the amount of fun to be had makes it more than worth it. I can only hope now that we can see a return for this style of aiming in the future that isn't relegated to VR. As great as VR is, it's extremely expensive. We've already seen a resurgence in motion controls thanks to Gyro, which has already done wonders for crosshair aiming schemes. I'd simply like to see what it could do for potential new cursor aiming schemes. I'd like to once again thank those who made it this far on this ridiculous topic that probably wasn't deserving of its own video, but fuck it, I wanted to ramble. And again, we're just chilling. So until next time, all that's left for me to do today is to say thank you for watching.